Time for a little history, as has been requested on the United States. One of the most interesting things about the American Revolution is that it's a bit of a stretch, but you could say the revolution came about because of some fake news. True. Now, they didn't use the term fake news back then, but it was some significant propaganda that was put out by the patriots. So let me tell you the example I'm thinking of here. Now, let's go back. UK, King George wasn't really involved with the colonies because the colonies were far, far away, and King George had some things going on in his head that he needed to deal with. So over here in the United States, everyone's like, woo, let's do our thing. And every single one of the colonies was like its own individual little country. They weren't connected at all. They didn't really care about each other. It was like sports teams that hate each other. So they're like, whatever. But one thing that can always make people come together is taxes. Now, in the UK, of course, King George is basically trying to take over the world. So they're out there colonizing all over the place. And because of this, they're having to fight the indigenous people, the native peoples, on all of the lands that they're trying to take over and control. Because the people that lived there before they came were kind of upset about that, and rightfully so. So it was expensive. It was very expensive. And although King George wasn't good with numbers, he knew it cost a lot of money to keep taking other people's lands and putting the British flag in the land. So he's like, dude, we need to get some money. Where can we get it? So somebody said, well, the colonies aren't really paying as much as all of the other places. Our taxes here in England are huge compared to the colonies. Let's even that out a little bit. So boom, we have all of these laws passed over into the colonies stating we're going to tax this, we're going to tax that. The colonists were like, do you mind? We don't have that kind of cash here. We don't even have cash. So the king was like, oh my gosh, things are getting a little bit wonky over there in the colonies. Let's just get rid of everything except for the Stamp Act, which basically put a tax on things like playing cards and documents, those kinds of things. Honestly, the big issue here was it affected the rich people the most because they wound up having to pay the most tax because they had enough money to actually buy the stuff that was being taxed. So the rich people were like, man, this sucks. Especially John Hancock. He's like, this really sucks. I'm just a good, clean smuggler here, and I don't need all these extra tax stamps everywhere. So this is driving me crazy. So John Hancock is friends with Samuel Adams. Yes, that's Samuel Adams. And it's an odd couple because Samuel Adams was all bark but no bite in the end. He could really work a crowd up and say, yeah, we want our independence. We're going to go fight, win. But when it came down to actually pursuing that later on, he's like, I gotta go. So Samuel Adams was a doofus, and he was kind of nasty. Like, he only had one suit. He didn't really take any baths. Compared to John Hancock, who's like all bedecked out, bespeckled with all of his clean, rich clothes and his air of gorgeousness around him. But whatever. So you've got Samuel Adams. So anyway, the Sons of Liberty, right? It's a group of rabble-rousers, and they're getting together and they're like, oh, the taxes, we hate the taxes. So what they decide to do is to go to a customs office, a customs home. So the man in charge of the customs, kind of the equivalent of what we would think of as an embassy. So a big group went over to the house and were like, this really sucks. You people suck. We hate you. You don't even know what we're doing over here. You don't care about us. And so the customs dude shoots out the window because they had thrown stuff in to break his windows. So he responds with a shot out the window and unfortunately unalived an 11-year-old boy. That didn't go over very well. That was like, ooh, that's not good stuff. So they went to the funeral of the 11-year-old boy, huge turnout, and it got everybody all like, ooh, we can't just have this coming on with all of these red coats everywhere, because King George had sent over a whole bunch of people to kind of keep the law in peace. And so these red coats were just all around town, like sleeping in people's houses, taking their wives, taking their ducks. I mean, it didn't matter. They were just like in control. So people were like, we don't like all you people here with the red coats, go on, get. And so the red coats were like, we're not leaving. We were given an order and we're here to do it. So too dang bad. Anyway, so back to the funeral. They go to the funeral and they're like, oh, we can't stand this anymore. So a couple of days later in that same location, there were some workers getting off of work, and then there were some redcoats walking by with their muskets, and then they started picking fights with each other, and, you know, some fisticuffs were going on, and some slapping, some hair pulling. It wasn't good, but nobody unalived, but there was significant fighting going on. So things kind of got broken up. And then later, back at that same residence outside, there were redcoats in front of the building trying to protect it, much like French law enforcement that was getting bricked in, if you saw my last post on that. So the redcoats are like, dudes, what are you guys doing here? And a big crowd comes in and they start throwing snowballs. You're like, oh, who cares about snowballs, right? The snowballs had things like glass and rocks in them. My personal favorite, the oyster shells, and that could cause a little bit of damage. So the redcoats are like, what are we going to do? There's only a few of us. There's like this huge mob coming at us because they don't like, what, taxes? Like, what's going on? So from out of nowhere, in the dark, someone says fire, and they do. 3 of the people in the crowd, 3 of the colonists, were immediately unalived. Now, 2 more were unalived later from their injuries. So it was like a lot of people got hurt. Ultimately, 5 people were unalived, and all of the redcoats then were arrested and taken to jail. Now, all of the colonists, of course, were like, you need to get rid of these guys. We hate them. They killed people. We hate them. We don't want them around here anymore. You know, meanwhile, they're like, well, we still have a court system that we need to respect. So John Adams is like, oh man, this sucks. I'm a lawyer and I think everybody should get a fair trial, but you know, it looks really bad. And like Samuel Adams was involved in this, and you know, family, and you know, I've got depression issues. So Adams finally says, fine, I'll represent them. In the interest of justice, I will represent these redcoats because everybody deserves a fair trial. And he did. And 2 of them were found guilty of manslaughter. They should have been put to unalive, but instead their thumbs were branded with an M for manslaughter. Anywho, that takes us really far away. So that's the story. But one of the things you may think, well, what's the big deal? How does that involve fake news? All right. After the massacre occurred, Paul Revere, one of my least favorite founding fathers, decided he would use his talent as an artist to sketch out what happened at the Boston Massacre. Now, the story I'm telling you is based off of multiple different sides, but ultimately, no one really knows what happened. No one really knows who fired that first shot. No one really knows who said fire. We don't really know because the 2 sides of the story are so vastly different and everybody believes that they're telling the truth. Ultimately, Paul Revere came in and put a sketching together. And here is the sketching that he put and published. So this is what his version of the Boston Massacre looked like. And you can see by looking at that, it tells a very different story than the people who were actually there. So again, we don't truly know what happened, but this picture got everybody all upset and pulled everybody in and said, this is it. We're done. We're not taking any more from the redcoats. Look at what they did based off of what Paul Revere put out into the media. So once that picture hit the public was like, public opinion, those guys need to be put to the unalive place. And we need to like come together as a cohesive unit so that we can take our country back from the redcoats who don't care about us and keep taking all of our stuff and harming us. So Paul Revere, fake news with the sketch of the Boston Massacre, where ultimately we really don't know what happened. A few people were unalived, unfortunately, but some soldiers were harmed significantly. And the whole thing had to do with the colonists were not following the law that they were under at the time. Now, I'm not a huge fan of Paul Revere when he went and said, hey, the redcoats are coming. I don't really care about all of that. What I'm interested in is the fact that this sketch could be seen as the ultimate tipping point into the Revolutionary War. And that sketch, by a lot of accounts, is not accurate at all. So, did the Revolutionary War start because of fake news? I think it's absolutely possible. In the end, as everybody knows, the war went forward, and we were able to have our independence from the UK because eventually King George was like, y'all are giving me a headache.